and we will go to Lebanon next. From there, Ali did a great job of covering the Iran missile attack, so we will take it right to Lebanon, where more than 3,500 bombs dropped on so-called Hizballah positions. We know that there are all kinds of civilians caught up in this, in all these operations. Hizballah this week admitted that 1,500 of its fighters were wounded in the pager and walkie-talkie operation. We know that the total number of injured in those operations was in the 3,000s. So we're talking about more than 50% of the pager hits were civilians, not fighters. And the Israelis this week talked about their delimited incursion into the border areas up in the Galilee Panhandle. And you can see here, the strikes are all over. They're all over Lebanon this week. And I just want to say to the Nasrallah point, it's important to frame Nasrallah's assassination in the context that the Israelis put it in. And that is in a history, 40 years of defeats, consistent string of defeats organized by the fighters that he led right from the beginning, going back to the 1982 invasion when they took out the early Hezbollah fighters of Islamic Jihad, took out the U.S. Embassy twice. They wiped out the CIA station. The entire Middle East station was wiped out. Going into the Iraq War, the CIA talked about how that attack in the 1980s left them with no intelligence for the Iraq War because they lost a generation of CIA agents and knowledge and institutional knowledge in those operations. They also captured the CIA director or the station chief in Beirut in another attack. They hit the Marine Corps barracks and killed 240, drove the Americans out of Lebanon with that attack. They carried out multiple car and truck bomb attacks on Shabak, Israel's internal security that had set up in South Lebanon, famous attacks that really launched the Islamic resistance in many ways. There's the Ansariya attack, where Israeli special forces in 1997, under the command of Yoav Gallant, came across on a secret assassination mission that Hezbollah counterintelligence caught and wiped out the special forces naval commandos that on that raid in Ansariya, something that stuck in the Israelis' craw right till the 2000 fleeing of Lebanon, which we've talked about on this program, but involved literally running away from their positions, leaving their computers on. No more way to articulate a defeat than leaving your helmet hung up on the wall and just turn around and run down the hill, which is literally what the Israelis did. They ran down the hill, and the Palestinian and the Lebanese in the villages went up to 𝐓𝐡𝐞, a famous torture prison, took rocks and broke into the prison and liberated the prisoners. These pictures were all over the world. They galvanized support for the resistance for Hezbollah, of course. And then there's the 2006 war, where Hezbollah begins the war by crossing the border, capturing Israeli soldiers to exchange for Lebanese prisoners who did not get returned because the 2000 evacuation fleeing by the Israelis, there was no negotiation, so they didn't return prisoners. So Hezbollah crossed the border to capture prisoners, sparked the 2006 war that everybody admits. The Israelis' blue ribbon panel admitted it was a defeat. U.S. war colleges were even more harsh on how big a defeat it was, that the Israeli military wasn't ready for the hardened fighters of Hezbollah that had been training for this battle. That was in 2006. Okay, that just takes you to 2006. In the years intervening, Israel was unable to do what it had done in Lebanon for the 2 decades before that. And when this war started, immediately Nasrallah opens up a northern front in support of Gaza, and that northern front liquidates Israeli communities from the north, creates for the first time in Israel's history a buffer zone inside Israel. The security zone, as it was called in Lebanon, is inside Israel for the first time. People like 60 Minutes, when I showed that clip of Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes going into the northern communities, they're talking about humiliation, defeat, the loss of the north. They've given up all this land. They're never going to move back to there. The Radwan units on the border make it so that they'll never live there on those borders again. So it's just victory after victory that Hezbollah's organization, led by him as a military commander, just inflicted on the Israelis year after year, covering 4 decades before this event. And the chief of staff, or the trajectory, and through that, there had been assassinations of other key leaders, right? Imad Mugnia was assassinated in 2008, Mustafa Badruddin in 2013, Qasem Soleimani in 2020. But the trajectory of this organization hasn't changed by those significant losses, particularly Imad Mugnia, Haj Radwan, who the Radwan forces, special forces that Israel hasn't yet encountered but will encounter in their ground invasion, are named after. He was a devastating loss to the organization in 2008, particularly to their military. And the trajectory of the group doesn't change from those losses. The trajectory remains the same. And that's something that Nasrallah pointed out all the time in all of his speeches, because they have commemorative speeches as part of the popular education, is to teach people about the history of the resistance. And Nasrallah took that very seriously and did lectures constantly on annual basis, recognizing the martyrs that had come before. And so this happened, this assassination of Nasrallah happened at a time that Israel couldn't have imagined, where the United States would allow Israel to do whatever it wants, that it could carry out its Zionist fantasy of destroying Gaza and invading Lebanon and attacking Nasrallah. And Halevi said it. We need to continue attacking Hezbollah, he said. We have been waiting for this opportunity for years. So they see this as a moment to just go wild. And that's what you're seeing. And that's what we have been absorbing over the last 2 weeks of shocking events that Israel has inflicted, that will be humbled by a ground invasion into South Lebanon. We won't make predictions again, but we saw the fighting in 2006, and there's 18 years of preparation for this battle from both sides. Admittedly, Israel's intelligence on Hezbollah is a lot more significant than it is on Qassam. We haven't seen any of these kind of operations successful on Qassam. They've kept their internal network completely sealed, and there'll be a lot more to know about the details of the Nasrallah assassination and how it happened in the coming days. But it's not just Hezbollah leadership that's being taken out. The other day, Israel took out the top 2 commanders of the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and they also assassinated with his family the leader of Hamas in Lebanon. So these border incursions that sound like they barely got across the barbed wire fence are the first face-to-face battles. But I'm going to show you this week, because I'm going to bring up everything that happened in the last week. Even though events have overtaken some of these things, just to understand how we got to this position and to continue covering this on a week-by-week basis. Next week, we'll probably be having footage of face-to-face battles. But if we look at number 20 here tomorrow, the week began with red alert sirens all over Tel Aviv. Millions of Israelis, 2.something million Israelis, fled to shelters because the Glilot Mossad and Unit 8200 headquarters is at the Glilot intelligence base outside Tel Aviv. Ali talked a little bit about that, because they were the target of the ballistic missile attack by Iran. So you can see number 21, Hezbollah showed us the missile. They're upgrading. They're showing us the next tier. They showed us last week the tier before this. Now they're showing the next tier of their ballistic missile. They're calling it the Qadr 1. It looks to be a modified Fatah 110, which is a precision-guided heavy payload rocket. And they're describing here a 500-kilogram warhead with a 190-kilometer range. And we need to keep those kilometer ranges in mind when Israel says they're doing a pinpoint, or a delimited is the word they're using, operation on the border, as if that will stop rocket fire. That's not the way it works. The rockets are not fired from the barbed wire border. In the case of this particular Qadr weapon, you have a 190-kilometer range. So you can fire deep into Israel from a firing position that's deep inside Lebanon. And as the war goes on, and as troops, if they do move into the southern area, to the border area, I'll believe it when I see it if they get past the border area. But they're still going to have these rockets firing over their head into the communities behind them. And that happened all week. So this is a precision-guided weapon, Hizballah says, and it can maneuver in flight with precision. So if this level of munition were to be pulled out, Hizballah hasn't pulled them out in en masse yet. The Israelis expected 4,000 rockets and missiles on the first day of a war. It's not clear if this would be counted as the first day of a war, but Hizballah has the capacity to do that. And they're choosing at this point to slowly escalate. And as Nasrallah said, they don't want total war. They don't want their countries destroyed and their people killed. And famously, after the 2006 war, Nasrallah was asked if he regretted the operation that caused all that destruction in Lebanon. And he said, if I had known that cost, then yes, like I would not have done it again. He's a very popular leader for decisions like that, not taking the destruction of a war and then throwing it on your people because it works to bolster your organization. He's a true popular leader, grown from the people and responding to the people in a way that nobody wants open war. Nobody wants total war. You try to operate in all ways possible before total war. And that's what we're seeing from Hizballah. And we've seen that kind of patience all this week. They've been firing 300 rockets, which is double the amount of the peak of the 2006 war, but nothing like what they could do. If we look at number 22, these rocket attacks, they're going to show you the placement of these rocket attacks, 28 kilometers deep into Israeli territory, hitting these bases. And again, they're hitting these with the Fadi 1 and Fadi 2 rockets that I showed you on the last show that have 70 to 100 kilometers range. So these rockets can also be fired from well behind the border area that Israel says that if they have pinpoint operations, that the rocket fire will allow people to return to the north, which is not true. So this is a war to separate the Gaza and Lebanon fronts, the very thing Nasrallah said that they would not do. And so Israel's attempting that here. We're seeing consistently 300 rocket attacks each day over the past week. And the readiness of the fighters beyond the assassinations and their commanders of the founding generation, it's significant. But Hizballah is trained in a different way than to be beholden to a centralized leadership. They fight small unit tactics, decentralized, and their leadership, their overall leadership, the commanders that were their commanders for 40 years are significantly important leadership. But they don't change the readiness of the organization because there's multiple levels of command. And it's devastating loss. But the force readiness is not impacted by these assassinations, as shocking as they are. To lose basically the entire leadership command. People talk about decapitation, that the leadership was decapitated. You could possibly say that the top echelon of their command was decapitated, but in a meaningful sense of the word decapitation would mean that once you've cut the head off, the rest of the organization doesn't exist. And that's not what happens. These rocket attacks, they come out, Hizballah reports them in field reports. They come out every single day, 10, 12, 14, 16 qualitative operations, rocket barrages of the type that we're seeing here, hitting key institutions, military installations. You can see the settler cameras that Hizballah likes to add to these videos to show you some of the places where they landed. And because we have the military sensor, let's do 23. And these attacks, the attacks that they have withstood over this, the 3,500 bombs dropped on Hizballah targets all over Lebanon, particularly on their command and control and rocket platforms in the south. The Israeli military says that they've taken out 10% of Hizballah's capacity. So we're talking about a war that is 362 days old, and they're only at 10%. And that 10%, that's above surface rockets. They're not able to reach their underground rocket facilities that we have shown on previous shows. So the 10% of 150 to 200,000 missile arsenal organization is minimal. And a portion of that 10% has been distributed throughout communities in northern Israel as well. And on number 24 is a qualitative operation. This is Hizballah versus 𝐓𝐡𝐞 13, Flotilla 13. This is naval commandos of the Israeli military. They were previously clandestine secret unit. Hizballah made it not that by showing exactly where their base is here. And we saw it in their drone footage earlier in the summer when they flew over it and showed us everything that works. So this is a drone swarm that Hizballah is firing here, multiple drones being launched here at the Flotilla 13 base, at the Special Forces base. These are Ababil one-way attack drones. We've seen these be used a number of times. Hizballah has half a dozen different types of drones that are explosive-laden one-way attack drones that they use on these different targets, military targets. Hizballah is targeting military targets. The only civilian targets that Hizballah has hit is evacuated settlements, and they have destroyed evacuated settlements in a manner in which the villages in South Lebanon have been destroyed. But if you'll notice, they never say in the media how many civilians have been killed by attacks from Lebanon, and it's because the number is something like 6 in a year. Hizballah is not targeting civilians; they're targeting military bases, and that's what we see over and over in these operations. If they were targeting civilians, you could have death tolls in the tens of thousands based on their rocket arsenal and the population density, were you to rain down these rockets on civilian, effectively to terror bomb like the Israelis do, bomb civilians in the hopes that those civilians will break away from their military leadership, which is what Israel does to the resistance. The resistance doesn't do that to Israel. It doesn't target their civilians to make the war unpopular. And number 25 here, this is a base, the Megiddo airfield being targeted here with Fadi 1, 2, and 3 rockets. Megiddo is the intersection of Armageddon, but it's also the home of a Israeli Air Force airfield, logistics airfield that they use as a backup. This is just north. This is around Afula. It's just north of Jenin in the West Bank. 60 kilometers from the border are these targets. So these targets are 60 kilometers from the border. They can fire them from 40 kilometers inside Lebanon. So Israel's not penetrating 40 kilometers inside Lebanon anytime soon. So it's not clear that these operations that Israel is carrying out right now and suffering such significant defeats already are going to attempt to try to regain territory at that depth. And as long as that's not happening, the rocket fire won't stop, and the communities in the north won't go home. And as Nasrallah said in his final speech, in fact, it'll make the war less likely. The war will make it less likely that Israelis return to their homes. And if they do return to their homes, they'll return to destroyed homes that are the product of this war that Hizballah has carried on. So the Megiddo military airport is a runway and airport used by the Air Force for emergency and logistics. The Amos base is the main transportation and logistics support hub for the northern region. So that's feeding their troops with their supplies in the north. And then the third target was the main factory for explosive materials in the Zionist entity. It is 60 kilometers from the border. So they're targeting military bases, logistics airfields, and ammo production factories. And we know that they have this intelligence because they showed us it in the drone footage that they've put over. And if anything, they have been continually disciplined throughout the week. These operations didn't change at all. If you only followed the war through field reports from the Israelis and from Hizballah, but particularly from Hizballah, you wouldn't have noticed the calamity that was happening, the catastrophe that was happening in Beirut. to their leadership, to their senior most leadership, their most respected founding leadership that have all of those victories I listed at the beginning notched on their belts. You can't see any impact on the readiness of the ability of the fighting force in Hezbollah. They fight in small units, decentralized, and talk today from the early incursion is that Radwan forces weren't even involved in the battle today. That cost the Israelis at least 8 killed soldiers and a number of destroyed Merkava tanks, apparently. That was just their territorial defense. It wasn't Radwan special forces coming in on that. So one more here. 27 is a rocket stitch of attacks on northern bases, and these happened just the other day. These are 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐿 300 millimeter rockets and Katyusha rockets, Grad rockets, and these are fired in barrages, as I've shown you before, between 28 and 40, depending on the unit launcher, one after another, and these are not intercepted. Despite the Iron Dome's vaunted record, as Ali pointed out in the Iran segment, the story of the number of these rockets to be shot down versus the number that are fired is wildly different than the Israeli estimates. Of course, we remember after the first True Promise operation by Iran, when Israel said that it was 99% effective. This time they said most, and we just watched in Ali's video dozens, scores of them clearly landing. Certainly some interceptions, but part of the Iranian attack was to target the radar stations that work the Arrow and David Sling, the medium and long range missile defense capabilities that Israel has. So they were targeted as part of that operation that also targeted the Mossad headquarters, the Nevatim Air Base, the Tal Nof Air Base that the fighter jets took off for the assassination of Nasrallah. A brutal assassination, a brutal war crime, more than 80 bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, daisy chained together with bunker busters and hitting the target in the same spot with 4 separate rounds, 4 double tap rounds on that strike. So that is the resistance report from Lebanon.